Guest is one of Mr Johnson's supporters, but also a high-profile MP who many believe could be in line to be the next Foreign Secretary. Jacob Rees-Mogg joining us from Westminster. Mr Rees-Mogg, thank you for joining us on Sky News this afternoon.
Thank you, and thank you for that great build-up. I don't think anybody thinks I'm going to be the next Foreign Secretary, but I'm very flattered.
OK, what do you think they think you're going to be?
I don't think they think I'm going to be anything. I hope to remain the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset, which is a great honour. Oh,
I saw a Politics Home that was suggesting that you might be the next leader of the Conservatives. Not so?
I think in a parallel universe.
Oh, OK, so you're definitely ruling yourself out?
I'm not a candidate. There's no vacancy and I'm supporting Mrs May.
But if there is a candidacy, you would not stand?
I can't see there'd be any circumstances where I would be a candidate.
I'll take that as a no. What is Boris up to? Why is he writing 4,000-word essays in the Telegraph that was apparently a speech that he was refused permission to deliver by Number 10, so he gave it to the Telegraph as an article instead?
What Mr Johnson has done is very important. He is supporting government policy and he's putting it in a positive light. I fear there's been too much about Brexit that has been essentially we're doing it because we've got to, because people voted for it, rather than because it's an excellent thing to be doing. It's going to give the country a bright and successful and prosperous future. And Boris Johnson is grasping the positivity of it and putting that forward to the British people in full support of Mrs May and Conservative and government policy.
Sure, because he was told that he couldn't give that speech and so he gave the article to the Telegraph. That's undermining her, surely.
I don't think it is undermining her. That who told him not to give the speech? That,
Number 10.
You know,
Number 10 said don't do it.
Not the Prime Minister personally, and Prime Ministers
can
hairs,
Mr.
intervene
Rees-Mogg,
directly.
You're splitting hairs.
No, hairs are very important to be split, actually, because the Constitution works on the basis of ministerial responsibility and collective responsibility. Now, the Foreign Secretary has responsibility for foreign affairs, and that includes to a large degree our relationship with the European Union. It is reasonable for him to make speeches on that, and collective responsibility that requires him to be within the confines of government policy, which he was and he is. It's a really important speech, and it's changed the whole tone of the debate. At last, we're thinking about how we're going to prosper outside the European Union, rather than this poor little blighty approach that everything's so frightfully difficult. There's been too much Eeyore, and we want a bit more red rum.
Oh, OK. Although, of course, one of them was a donkey.
That's right. One's a donkey and one's a horse.
Yes, indeed,
right.
sir. I wonder which one was which.
Well, Eeyore is the gloomy one.
Yeah, I wonder which one of the Prime Minister and Boris is which.
Oh, goodness, I wouldn't dream of comparing either of them to a horse. I'm comparing, or indeed a donkey, the approach.
You said that just in the nick of time, Mr Rees-Mogg, before I picked you up on that. We've heard what the Home Secretary said. She's not happy at all with Boris. She thinks he's trying to backseat drive.
Well, I think the Home Office is in a difficult position because the Home Office is a ministry that comes under great pressure with Brexit because it's got to raise its standard and to raise its competence. That we've had a long-standing problem, going back decades, of the Home Office not being good at dealing with immigration from outside the European Union. And so the Home Secretary has a real challenge to make sure her department is ready by the end of March 2019 to enforce new border controls. And I understand that as the Home Secretary, she's being a bit cautious because it would be embarrassing for her if her department weren't ready.
So what do you suggest? What's your advice to the Home Secretary then, if you were giving her some this afternoon?
Well, I think the question for her is, can she get her department ready? Can she give it the political leadership that ensures that the Home Office is ready by the end of March 2019 to have immigration arrangements in place for people coming from the European Union that are similar to those for people coming from the rest of the world. The British people voted for Brexit, and one of the reasons they voted for it, in addition to democracy and taking back control, was to ensure that our borders were properly managed, and therefore to continue with free movement beyond 2019 would be a bad policy. But the Home Office has to be ready for action by the end of March 2019, and that's the job of the Home Secretary. It's a job of leadership and inspiration, and I'm sure she'll do it brilliantly.
As far as Boris is concerned, let's go back to him. He hardly provides encouragement for his colleagues, though, does he, on the front line, by saying that Britain, and I'm quoting him, has spent too much time trying and often failing to exert influence in the meeting rooms of Brussels. Hardly a rallying call, is it?
Well, I think it's a statement of truth. that David Cameron tried very hard to negotiate with the European Union and came back with next to nothing, thin gruel. And that's been the situation of our relationship inside the EU, that our ministers go off full of good intention, they do their best, they bat away, and then they're outvoted by qualified majority vote, or they don't even have a vote because they know they will lose it. So what Mr. Johnson is saying is factually accurate and is to do with our position inside the European Union rather than the capabilities of any individual minister.
Why do you think he hasn't been sacked by the Prime Minister by now? Because it's better to have someone inside the tent, or because she's lily-livered?
Oh, because it would be highly eccentric to sack somebody for supporting government policy and doing so enthusiastically. That what Boris Johnson has done is give the right approach to Brexit, to emphasise the positivity of government policy, and therefore he should probably be given a knighthood for it, certainly not sacked.
So you think Boris should be given a knighthood for the letter that he sent to the Telegraph, yeah?
I think what he said was really important and a boost to the morale of the country in these negotiations. In negotiations, you have to believe that you're going to win. It's no good going into negotiations being wet about it and being lily-livered, to use your turn of phrase. You have to go in boldly, believing that your cause is right and that you will do better at the end of the negotiation than you're doing at the beginning. He's set that out, and that's really powerful and important, and I think will be a great boost to Mrs May's speech in Florence, which I'm sure will take a tone from Mr Johnson's comments.
So in no way could this essay that was in the Telegraph at the weekend be seen in any way, shape or form, his attempt to set out his pegs to be the next leader of your party?
Well, if it were doing that, that's been what Mr Johnson has been saying for a very considerable amount of time. So there was nothing new in it in that context, that Boris Johnson has been the leading Brexiteer. He holds in his pocket essentially a commission from the Leave campaign to ensure that Leave is implemented properly. So there's nothing new in that. No, what he was doing was revitalising, reinvigorating government policy that perhaps was at risk of getting a bit bogged down. So I think it's a really important and helpful contribution for both the government and for the nation.
Would he make a good Prime Minister?
Well, Mrs May is a fabulous Prime Minister, and may she reign forever. Amen, amen, alleluia, alleluia, amen.
That doesn't happen, of course, because we're human, but my question remains the same.
You never know advances in modern medicine.
Yeah, even Conservative leaders are not immortal. Would he make a good Prime Minister?
Boris Johnson is a man of immeasurable ability. I did actually back him at the beginning of the leadership campaign last year, and I obviously did so because I thought he would be an excellent Prime Minister, but I wouldn't want, by saying how good he is, to imply that I don't fully support Mrs May, who deserves our support.
Are we likely to see you and Boris arm wrestling for the top job?
If I arm wrestled anybody, I would lose, so I'm not going to do that.
That's a good place to leave it, I suppose. It's good of you to come back. Thank you very much.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.